Thank you, Sharon. I have a three-part lecture for you tonight. I'm going to first talk about why is it that Art Deco architecture in South Florida is different from Art Deco architecture in other cities around the world. And the second thing I'm going to talk about is how is it that Miami Beach became the first city in the world to have an Art Deco preservation movement. And then I'm going to talk about the World Congress on Art Deco, which is the main reason why I'm here. First, why is Art Deco architecture in South Florida different? Well, in the early 20th century, Los Angeles was becoming the film capital of the world. New York was becoming the economic capital of the world. Chicago was booming because of the Erie Canal. Detroit was becoming the center of automobile manufacture. Tulsa was growing because of the oil industry. Seattle was becoming a major trade center with Asia, as was San Francisco, which of course had already had its gold rush. And Miami Beach was a swamp. There were less than 50 people living in Miami Beach at the turn of the 20th century. There were fewer than 500 people living in Miami. Today it's a metropolitan area of 2.5 million people. But at the time, everything was small. Everything was built by chance. What we call vernacular architecture. It was built by the people who were going to use it. The city of Miami Beach wasn't incorporated until 1915. The first roads were built in 1913. The first causeway between Miami and Miami Beach was built in 1919. The population grew from 644 in 1920, this is the population of Miami Beach, to about 15,000 in 1925. So a period of 5 years. The predominant architectural style in Miami Beach was the Mediterranean Revival style. You have a lot of that here in Palm Beach County. In fact, there's a lot of it throughout South Florida. Throughout the United States, for that matter. It had been popularized by various international expositions. But then, in 1926, a major hurricane struck directly South Beach. And destroyed much of what had been built up to that time, because the construction wasn't all that great. That hurricane, if it were to strike today, would be considered a Category 4 hurricane. So it was really powerful, and it did strike directly on South Beach. It brought the Depression to Miami Beach early. But Miami Beach also recovered from the Depression early. And the reason for that was tourism. Between 1930 and 1940, the population of Miami Beach doubled to 28,000 people. Miami Beach had annual visitors of 75,000 people by that time, by 1940. So there was a lot of rebuilding being done in Miami Beach and throughout South Florida in the 1930s, in particular the late 1930s. Well, all those other cities that I mentioned were building Art Deco buildings in the 20th century. I mean in the 1920s. So buildings like Rockefeller Center, like the Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building, those were built at a time when Art Deco was much more decorative, much more elaborate style. Whereas in Miami Beach, it was a much simpler architectural style, because by the late 30s, the architecture had become less decorative, more geometric, more streamlined. So let's take a look at some of those, some of the buildings in Miami Beach that you'll be seeing if you come to see us for the World Congress. These are the first ones I'm going to show you are all Ocean Drive hotels, and as you look at them, what is similar about all these hotels? Pardon me?
Flat roofs.
Flat roofs, yes. What else?
In that line.
Eyebrows, yes. Yeah. What about the streamlined? Absolutely. Yes. Geometric, yes. What about the form of the buildings? They're all 2 or 3 story buildings. They're human-sized buildings rather than skyscrapers. So, and the same is true of many of the Art Deco buildings here in the Palm Beaches and elsewhere in South Florida. So that's one of the things that makes Art Deco architecture in South Florida unique. Also, these buildings were built primarily by relatively small investors. These weren't, these weren't built by chain hotels. None of them were built by Hilton or Marriott or any of those other companies. They were built by relatively small investors who saw an opportunity to make money off of the booming tourism in Miami Beach. And so they would build these small hotels. The average size of a hotel at the time was only about 50 rooms. And in addition to that, the decorative elements of these hotels tended to reflect the weather, the climate here. We call it tropical deco, and the seaside nature of Miami Beach and similar communities. And the apartment buildings that were built behind those hotels, that is to say toward the west, also tended to be more human scale. 2 or 3 stories, geometric in form, quite beautiful, but nonetheless relatively simple. And here you see how the decorative elements in these buildings tended to reflect the seaside nature of Miami Beach. This beautiful carved concrete element beside the entrance to this building depicts underwater scenes. There are fish in there and seaweed. It's quite unique. The same building has this wave pattern along the top of the parapet. I presume you all know what a parapet is, but maybe you don't. The parapet is the extension of the wall above the roof line of the building. The wave pattern is very common in Miami Beach architecture. Here are more examples. Here's another Miami Beach building, which is more likely to be similar to buildings in other cities, at least in the outlying neighborhoods of those cities. You wouldn't find this in a downtown area, but notice that it's commercial on the ground floor, residential above, and a lot of detailing. This particular notice the zigzag patterns, for instance, very common on Art Deco architecture, and also notice the elaborate decorative element, which at the same time is both tropical and suggestive of a frozen fountain. Another very common element in Art Deco architecture everywhere. Even our theaters are small by comparison to theaters in the rest of the country, but nonetheless beautifully decorated inside and out. And our commercial buildings along Lincoln Road also reflect the same kind of geometry, perhaps a little more elaborate, because they are commercial buildings after all, and they have to attract people. So they are typically, the commercial buildings are typically more decorative than the hotels and the residential buildings. Later on, Lincoln Road was made into a pedestrian mall by the famous architect Lapidus. And we'll talk a little bit more about him later. But the buildings are along Lincoln Road are still largely Art Deco buildings. We also had a library in Miami Beach, which is now the home of the Bass Museum, but originally built as a library and built in 1930, and therefore more reflective of the detailing that you see in other early 1930s buildings. Note, for instance, these seagulls in the corners of the building. Quite unique, and again, reflective of the past that we're talking about the seaside, after all. So now, let's move on to my second topic. How is it that Miami Beach became the first city in the world to have an Art Deco preservation movement? Well, after World War II, tourism moved to Middle Beach. New hotels began to be built in the mid-century modern style, what we in Miami call MIMO, or Miami Modern. So much larger, more sophisticated, more all-service kinds of hotels began to be built in Mid-Beach. Hotels like the Eden Rock and the Fontainebleau, both of which were designed by Lapidus, but there were many others as well, designed by other architects. So these small buildings in South Beach began to deteriorate. they weren't profitable anymore. And they became homes, they became very, very cheap housing, affordable housing before we had the term affordable housing, but very affordable, very cheap. And many of the people who lived there were Jewish. Some were Holocaust survivors. And the buildings, the building owners were not making a whole lot of money off of those buildings, and so they weren't keeping them up. And the buildings began to deteriorate. Then along came a woman by the name of Barbara Bayer Capitman. Barbara moved to Miami Beach along with her husband, William, in 1973. They moved from Westchester County, New York. Barbara was a graphic artist. William was an economist and a market researcher. They hadn't been here 2 years before William died in 1975. And Barbara was looking for something to do with her time and her energies. She met Leonard Horowitz, an interior designer and an openly gay man. He had, because of his profession, an interior designer, he had an appreciation for the architecture of the buildings in Miami Beach. And so he took Barbara on a walking tour. And she immediately fell in love with the architecture. But she also was very interested in the people who were living in those buildings. She and Leonard were both Jewish. As I said before, most of the people living there were Jewish. She wanted to improve their living conditions, and she saw the restoration and preservation of these buildings as a way to improve the lives of the people who lived there. And she said as much at the time. And so in 1976, Barbara and Leonard and friends, some of whom were architects, most of whom were young, formed the Miami Design Preservation League. Within 3 years, by 1979, they got the Art Deco district onto the National Register of Historic Places. A phenomenal achievement for a number of reasons. One, it was the largest historic district on the National Register at the time, over 2,000 buildings. So a lot of documentation had to be put together. Two, the buildings were less than 50 years old at the time. This is historic? That's why it's called, officially, the Art Deco Architectural District, rather than the Art Deco Historic District. And getting it put on the National Register required a lot of ear bending, a lot of lobbying, and it was primarily Barbara who did that. And she managed to get it done. So then, a few years later, Barbara and her friends Michael Knurk and Dennis Wilhelm, who were among the founders of the Miami Design Preservation League, they piled into an old broken down car and started traveling around the United States. And I mean all around the United States. And everywhere they went, to all those cities that I mentioned earlier, and other cities as well, everywhere they went, they looked for Art Deco buildings. They also looked for people like Sharon, people who were also interested in Art Deco architecture and in preservation. And they met with those people and told them what was happening in Miami Beach and encouraged them to start their own Art Deco societies. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Sharon for a moment and ask her to reminisce a little bit about
Thank you.
Barbara.
Thank you. I was a member of the Art Deco Society in New York. I got, they have these trade shows just like we have now, the Palm Beach Antique Show and the Valentine's Jewelry Show. They had a show in New York, and I picked up 1 million brochures, and one of them was Art Deco New York. And I joined and I volunteered. I lived in Brooklyn, not Manhattan. That was like, whoa, Manhattan. But I went to the meetings and they had antique happy hours. I volunteered. I designed the graphics in a program, and they opened up the Cloud Club in the Chrysler Building. And I was invited to that with a date, and we were on our way to go to the Chrysler Building, the Cloud Club, and they burglarized his business, and we had to make a U-turn, and I was all dressed up for the Cinderella for the ball, and I missed it. And it didn't even work out with him, so that was really But another thing in New York, my house was burglarized, my whole family was moving to Florida. I said, nice knowing you, I would never move to Florida. And when my house was burglarized, within 2 weeks I begged them, don't leave me here, I'm coming. And when I lived, like I said, I lived in Brooklyn, and people said, oh, you should live in Manhattan. So when I moved to Florida, I followed my parents, they lived in West Lake Worth. I moved to Delray. Everyone said, oh, you should live in Miami if you like Art Deco. It was like, I made a joke, I never live in the right place. And then people said, you have to call Barbara Kapanen. And I'm like, hello, my name is Sharon, and people said I should call you. And she said, well, send me $25 membership and I'll talk to you. 36 years ago. So I sent a check, I charged her $35 out. 36 years ago, I sent her $25, and she said, come on down. And I was living with a man at the time, and we went down, and she said, Sharon Koskow, you will start the Art Deco Society of the Palm Beaches. And I'm like, what? I'm a mural artist, I'm a designer. I don't know anything even, I liked Art Deco, but I didn't really know about architecture. And she taught me everything about architecture, about Miami and around the world. And I met Michael and Dennis. A picture of them is in my book that you should all buy tonight, Art Deco of the Palm Beaches. And I met Leonard. Barbara went to Miami for a conference. I went with them. I stayed with Leonard. We shared a room together. Did you know that?
I didn't know that.
Unfortunately, Leonard passed away of AIDS right after that. But I was heavily involved in all these people in Miami that were like, oh, have a fashion show. Oh, have a bus trip. Oh, and I just started doing all these things up here. And in fact, we had to discover all these buildings. When the Armory Art Center was going to be demolished in 3 weeks, they had $85,000 towards the demolition of this building. The Norton Gallery and School of Art kicked out their school. Oh, we don't want a school anymore, it's too much trouble. So there were all these instructors and artists, and a few blocks away from the Norton, they found this building. Oh, we'll turn this into an art center. So I remember coming to look at it, it was all black and moldy. And I said, Gay Wolf at the time was my friend. She was president of the Norton Artists Guild, and I was the vice president of the Norton Museum of Art and Artists Guild. Anyway, I said, I think this building is Art Deco. This building. And I'll never forget. She goes, oh, no, you don't know what you're talking about. I don't know. I think nobody wanted to be Art Deco. And I had to discover all the buildings in Palm Beach County, literally drive through the streets, because it's not a concentration like Miami. our buildings here are even more rare and more endangered, because if someone tore this one building down, no, you wouldn't say, oh, you killed the neighborhood. If you tear down a hotel in South Beach, it's like, oh, the neighborhood. So I had to discover everything. We had to, I'd go back to Barbara Kaplan and go, is this what you mean? Because, I was used to New York Art Deco, which is vertical and streamlined, and not streamlined, these vertical skyscrapers. Here in Florida, with the flat land, our buildings tend to be horizontal like a boat. But I go to Barbara and goes, is this Art Deco? And she goes, oh yeah, that's streamlined modern, that's our favorite kind. So technically, our buildings here in Palm Beach County are streamlined modern. We just call everything Art Deco from 1925 to 1939, which ended because of the war. The factories, everything was World War II. But you could call it nautical deco, or streamlined modern, or depression modern. As John talked about, right after Art Deco, we never talk about that here. We're going to start talking about mid-century modern, because those buildings are now more than 50 years old, and they're historic. In Florida, our buildings, our oldest buildings, are Art Deco. We don't have buildings 300 years old, go to Europe, 600 years old. This is our history. And even though you might be snowbirds and live other places, history matters. And Florida's history really matters. So we discovered all these buildings, and we started the Art Deco Society. From day one, we were doing bus trips to Miami. So I learned how to do bus trips and walking tours, and it turns out when we have these Art Deco World Congresses, we meet all the other people. And, they're all doing these bus trips and walking tours and educational things. So, when we go to Miami, though, everyone loves it. They had their honeymoon there, right? Everybody has memories of growing up in Miami and the hotels there. We just didn't know they were special. We knew they were special, but we didn't know that there was this cohesive name called Art Deco. Art Deco started at the 1925 International Exposition des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels, Arts Décoratifs. And in 1968, they looked back and said, let's just call everything Art Deco. That was modern, right? That word modern. So now, in the 50s and 60s, we're having this World Congress come here, and I'm going to be talking all about this next Art Deco Second Wednesdays, March 8th. But I go and I discover, because the bus is going to come up from Miami, the bus will be all week. Wait, let's start again. The bus will go, the tour will start in Orlando. And they're going to go to Bach Tower and what's the name of that historic center?
The Maitland Art and History Museum.
Then they'll come to Miami.
I'll be talking about that shortly.
Right, I'll have a week of lectures, and then they'll come to the Palm Beaches. So I needed, when they come up in the bus, the first stop. Many of you went on a bus trip to WMODA, Wiener Museum of Decorative Arts. Well, it was all set, but now they're moving. They have a new home, they've secured a new home. That is the most incredible museum right here in Broward of decorative Art Nouveau and Art Deco ceramics and glass.
Do they have a new home yet?
They just got the home. They didn't open it. It will be about 4 to 6 months.
Oh.
But they have acquired a space. It's unbelievably wonderful. Anyway, so we needed a place. The Boca Raton Historic Society said, why don't you go to Lynn University? They have some interesting architecture there. And oh my God, it's fabulous. If you're a photographer of architecture, it's a delight. This mid-century modern, it's not a revolt against Art Deco. It's Art Deco enhanced. It's all the geometric, and it's concrete, it's all the technology. And it's something called brise soleil, or a concrete curtain, where there's geometrical shapes and the sun filters through and creates patterns, and it's fascinating. We're going to have a walking tour March 31st, which I'll have, you'll be able to sign up, of Lynn University in Boca Raton, mid-century modern architecture. And the tour, the lecture next month, Art Deco Second Wednesday will reflect. I'll show you all the pictures of the mid-century modern, and then we're going to go to IBM headquarters is now called BRIC, Boca Raton Innovative Complex. That was built by Bauhaus architect Marcel Breuer.
Yeah.
And we'll have lunch. It's a place called Marcel Brewery, a coffee shop. So we've all heard of Marcel Breuer as this architect. He designed that Cheska chair, the cane-back tubular chair. Well, he designed a building in Boca Raton. I had no idea. Growing up, I loved Bauhaus. Bauhaus is its modern design, form follows function, Corbusier, all these famous architects. And we have it right here in Boca Raton. I always would say there's no Art Deco in Boca Raton. Well, there's New Country Mind, and we're going to see it on the walking tour and next month's slides. Back to Jack.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we talked about the tour of the United States that Barbara and Michael and Dennis did, and how they helped to promote the preservation of Art Deco buildings in all the cities that they visited. Barbara unfortunately died in 1990. As Sharon mentioned, Leonard had died of AIDS in 1989. Barbara had started work on a book about that tour around the United States. And she had not completed it. So it was left to Michael and Dennis to complete the book, which was finally published in 1994.
Her first book was published, though.
Her first book had been published earlier, and it concentrated on Miami Beach. Yeah. Both books are available on Amazon, or occasionally they're resold, but neither one is still in print.